You're watching the Stories That Scare channel. There is no turning back now.
3 true drone repair shop horror stories that will make you delete your footage. Hey everybody, I'm glad y'all stopped by. Over the last decade, drones have become part of everyday life. People use them for photography, roof inspections, real estate, search and rescue, even just flying for fun. But eventually, every drone crashes, some into trees, some into lakes, some into places they were never supposed to be. When that happens, many owners bring them to a repair shop, usually with a broken propeller, a damaged camera, or a cracked frame. Most technicians simply replace the parts, test the drone, and send it back. But every now and then, a memory card is left inside, a flight log isn't erased, or a camera records something its owner never intended anyone else to see. I started searching online for stories from drone repair technicians who claim they experienced something they still can't explain while repairing customer drones. Whether these stories are true, or just another internet legend, I'll let y'all decide. Alright, let's get into the first one. This first story was shared by a drone repair technician from Colorado. Here's what he had to say. I'd worked in drone repair for almost 6 years. Most of my day involved replacing motors, installing new cameras, updating firmware. Nothing exciting. One Friday afternoon, a man walked into the shop carrying a badly damaged drone. The front arms were snapped. The landing gear was twisted. Half the propellers were missing. It looked like it had fallen out of the sky. The customer seemed nervous. He wouldn't make eye contact. He simply placed the drone on the counter. I just need the footage. I asked if he wanted the drone repaired too. No, just recover the video. He paid in cash, didn't leave a phone number, didn't leave an email. Just a first name. Then he walked out. I figured he'd come back later, so I carried the drone into the workshop. The camera itself had survived. The memory card was still inside. I connected it to my computer. The video opened immediately. It began exactly how you'd expect. A mountain trail, tall pine trees, blue sky. The drone climbed higher and higher. Whoever was flying it seemed to be searching for something. Then, the pilot suddenly stopped. The camera zoomed toward a clearing deep in the forest. At first, I couldn't tell what I was looking at. Just shadows beneath the trees. I increased the brightness. There, standing perfectly still in the clearing, was a little girl, maybe 8 years old, wearing an old white dress. She wasn't waving, she wasn't moving, she was simply looking straight up at the drone. Then she smiled. The drone immediately began descending. Not slowly, fast, like someone had slammed the controls forward. The camera shook violently as branches scraped against it. Leaves filled the screen. The pilot was obviously trying to land, or get away. Then, just before the video ended, the little girl was no longer standing in the clearing. She was standing directly beneath the drone, looking into the camera. Only, the drone was still nearly 50 feet above the ground. I paused the video, certain I'd missed something. Maybe the footage had glitched. Maybe the camera had skipped several seconds. I dragged the timeline backward, played it again. The little girl stood alone in the clearing. The drone was still high above the trees. Then, without a single frame showing her moving, she was suddenly beneath it, smiling, looking directly into the lens. The video ended with static. I checked the flight log. According to the GPS, the drone had never descended below 52 feet. That shouldn't have been possible. I exported the recovered footage, copied it onto a flash drive, and waited for the customer to return. He never did. Days passed, then weeks. Finally, company policy required us to archive the files before wiping the memory card. As I prepared to erase everything, I noticed a second video. It hadn't been there before. At least, I didn't remember seeing it. The file was only 9 seconds long. No date, no flight information, no file name, just, "Play me." I clicked it. The screen stayed black for several seconds. Nothing happened. Then, a little girl's voice quietly whispered, "You fixed my camera." My blood ran cold. The video suddenly flashed on. Not the forest, not the clearing. It was my repair bench, my shop. recorded from somewhere high near the ceiling. I watched myself sitting exactly where I was, working on the drone. Then, something slowly stepped into the frame behind me. I spun around. Nobody. When I looked back at the monitor, the figure was gone. The video ended. I immediately unplugged the computer, pulled the memory card, and snapped it in half. The strange part? When I checked our security cameras, there was no drone, no customer, no repair. For nearly 2 hours that afternoon, the cameras showed me sitting alone, talking to someone who wasn't there. I quit that shop 3 weeks later. To this day, I refuse to recover footage from drones people find in the woods, because sometimes the drone brings something back with it. Maybe not every memory card should be recovered. All right, let's move on to story number 2. This next story was shared by the owner of a small drone repair shop in Florida. Unlike most repairs, this drone wasn't dropped off by its owner. It was found floating in the middle of a swamp. And after watching the footage, everyone wished it had stayed there. The drone arrived in a muddy plastic storage bin. One of our regular customers had found it while fishing in the Florida Everglades. It was covered in algae. One landing leg was missing. The battery had swollen so badly, it looked like it might explode. He didn't want it repaired. He simply wanted to know what happened to it. Normally, water-damaged drones are a lost cause. But somehow, the memory card still worked. I inserted it into my computer. The first few videos were exactly what you'd expect. Alligators, wading birds, miles of open marsh. The owner obviously enjoyed wildlife photography. Then, I found the final flight. It began just before sunset. The drone lifted off from a small fishing boat. The camera slowly climbed above the reeds. The pilot flew farther and farther into the swamp. Almost 15 minutes passed. Nothing unusual. Then, the drone suddenly stopped, hovering over a tiny island. The place couldn't have been more than 30 feet across, just a handful of cypress trees, and a small wooden shack. No roads, no docks, no other buildings. It looked abandoned. The drone slowly descended. That's when I noticed. Someone was standing outside the shack. An older man, wearing dark overalls. He never looked up, never moved. He simply stood there, facing the front door. The pilot zoomed in, trying to get a better look. The camera became crystal clear. That's when I realized. The man wasn't breathing. His chest never rose. His clothes never moved in the wind. He looked frozen. Then, the shack door slowly opened. A little girl stepped outside. She couldn't have been older than 10. She looked directly at the drone. Then, without looking at the old man, she quietly said, "You're too late." The old man slowly turned his head toward the drone, not his shoulders, not his body, just his head, until it was facing completely backward. The pilot jerked the controls. The drone shot upward. The camera shook violently, but before it climbed away, every tree on the island was suddenly covered with people. Dozens of them, standing perfectly still among the branches, watching the drone leave. None of them blinked. None of them waved. They simply watched. The pilot flew as fast as possible back toward the boat. Then, the video cut to static. No crash, no warning, nothing. I checked the GPS flight log. According to the data, the drone never reached an island. It hovered over open water the entire time. There wasn't supposed to be any land, within 2 miles. Thinking the GPS must have failed, I searched satellite maps later that night. Nothing. No shack, no island, no trees, just water. The next morning, the fisherman called. He asked if we'd recovered anything interesting. I told him what we'd seen. There was a long silence. Then he quietly said, "That's impossible. I found the drone floating exactly where you said the island was. It wasn't floating in water. It was tangled in the branches of a cypress tree." I reminded him there weren't any trees there. He simply replied, "There aren't any more. They cut that island down decades ago." Sometimes, the camera records places that no longer exist. We've got one last story, and it's the reason one drone repair technician refuses to power on customer drones after sunset. This last story was shared by a drone repair technician from Washington State. He specialized in high-end commercial drones, the kind used by surveyors, construction companies, police departments, and search and rescue teams. He told me there was one repair he'll never forget. It was nearly closing time, about 6:45 p.m., when a woman rushed into the shop carrying a large drone case. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept in days. She set the case on the counter and quietly asked, "Can you tell me why it keeps coming back?" I wasn't sure what she meant. She opened the case. Inside sat a nearly brand-new drone, not a scratch on it. No broken propellers, no water damage, nothing. It flies away. By itself. I assumed it was a software issue, compass calibration, GPS interference, something simple. She shook her head. It only happens after dark. I brought the drone into the workshop, ran every diagnostic I could think of: battery, motors, GPS, compass, obstacle sensors. Everything came back perfect. Just before closing, I decided to perform one final test. I powered it on. The motors chirped, the camera calibrated. Then, without anyone touching the controller, the gimbal slowly rotated, not toward me, not toward the ceiling, toward the back corner of the shop, an area we used for storage. The camera locked onto the darkness. It refused to move. I grabbed the controller. Nothing. The gimbal wouldn't respond. Then, the drone quietly announced, "Subject located." I froze. That wasn't one of its programmed voice prompts. Before I could react, the propellers spun to life. The drone lifted off the repair bench, hovered perfectly still, then began flying deeper into the building. It slipped through the open storage room door. I chased after it. My flashlight bounced across old shelves, boxes, and spare parts. The drone stopped in the far corner. Its spotlight switched on by itself, illuminating a section of concrete wall. There was nothing there, just old paint. Then the wall slowly reflected a shadow. Someone was standing between me and the wall. I turned around. Nobody. I looked back. The shadow remained. It wasn't mine. It wasn't the drone's. It was taller, completely still. The drone softly announced again, "Subject confirmed." The battery instantly dropped from 98% to 0. The drone fell to the floor. Everything went dark. I stood there, barely breathing. Then, from somewhere inside the storage room, a voice quietly asked, "Did you find me?" I sprinted out, locked the shop, and waited outside until sunrise. The next morning, I searched every inch of that room. Nothing. Weeks later, the building's owner stopped by. I casually mentioned what had happened. His face immediately changed. He asked where the drone had stopped. I pointed toward the storage room. He nodded slowly, then told me something I'd never heard before. Long before our repair shop occupied that building, it had been used by a volunteer search and rescue organization. One volunteer disappeared during a mountain rescue. Despite weeks of searching, they never recovered his body. His equipment, including one of the organization's first drones, was stored in that very room. And according to the building owner, every few years, someone working there claims to hear the same question: "Did you find me?" I never worked another closing shift alone, and from that day forward, if a customer brought in a drone that supposedly flew by itself, I didn't argue. I didn't troubleshoot it. I simply handed it back. Some repairs aren't meant to be fixed. Maybe not every drone loses its signal. Maybe some of them find one. If you enjoyed these stories, let me know which one unsettled you the most. And if you've ever flown a drone, repaired one, or recovered footage that showed something you still can't explain, I'd love to read about it in the comments. Who knows? Your story might appear in a future episode. Until next time, keep the fires burning, and as always, I'll tell the stories if you'll stay scared.